first question I have is, your government has an extensive legislation record on criminal justice matters. Many of these laws have strengthened penalties and protected victims. Why have you pursued this agenda, and what motivates you?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question, Sheldon. Thank you for hosting us, and I want to thank everybody for being here. These are obviously important issues. While we say that the economy is the number one issue in this election, there are obviously a range of issues, and obviously the safety and security of our families and communities is a big one. We believe that there's no more important function of government, no function more central to the role of government in our society than making sure that we have safety and security in our own country. And I guess what motivates me more than anything, I could talk about the outrage I and others have felt when we've seen a crime not properly dealt with by authorities, but I think I'm influenced the most by two things. First of all, obviously being a father, having that experience, knowing your children are young and vulnerable and need to be protected even when you cannot see them, they're not in your presence. And the other is, meeting people like yourself, Sheldon, and not just leaders of organizations, but others across the country who have been victims of crime. And, we could talk about your organization, people like the Wombats, Yvonne Harvey, Sharon Rosenfeld. It really, has told us how important it is to people that governments do a better job of tackling the issues of crime and the tremendous damage it creates in our society. And so those are really the things that I think emotionally have motivated us. But obviously we've come forward with a range of issues, not just for children, not just for victims, but obviously things that deal strongly with a range of criminal justice matters, trying to crack down on gun gangs and drugs, obviously dealing with horrific cases of murder. And, these are in many ways unpleasant subjects to talk about, but Canadians have responded very well to, I think, to our government taking these issues much more seriously.
Thank you. You have introduced and passed 60 pieces of serious legislation with respect to criminal justice reform. Tell us about which initiatives you're most proud of and why.
Well, look, I'd say along the same lines. First of all, look, the most important thing is that we are changing the orientation of our criminal justice system. You and I were talking a little bit about this backstage. When we came to office, through 40 years, the system had gradually reoriented itself. And I don't just mean, to stress things like rehabilitation, because rehabilitation is an important part of the criminal justice system. We don't want to see people who commit a crime enter into a life of crime, but had gotten to the point where the entire system was focused on the welfare of the criminal, ignoring the victim and often discounting completely the effect of criminal activity on society to the point of essentially increasingly stripping away punishment for serious crimes. And this is something we've wanted to reorient. And, we started in the two areas I've talked about. Let's talk about victims. We have done things like create one of the most important pieces of legislation. One of the things I think we're most proud of is the Victims' Bill of Rights, where for the first time in this country, victims actually have some rights under our law. The rights to protection, to restitution, to information, to participation. Our principle is that the welfare of the victim must be put ahead of the welfare of the criminal. And I think for the first time, that's what this legislation does. It puts the victim at the center of the criminal justice process instead of the offender, particularly the convicted offender. And, I can talk about ways we've done that beyond the Victims' Bill of Rights. Things like eliminating the faint hope clause, the life means life legislation we're going to proceed with. Go ahead. What these kinds of things do is they avoid a situation where victims have to have the crimes done to them relitigated and reopened year after year, often for no purpose whatsoever. Something else I should mention about victims, we have, as you know, also put significant amounts of money into enhanced prevention and treatment services for victims, but particularly things like women's shelters for those who face risks of domestic abuse. On the children's side, I think you're very familiar. We're going to talk a little bit about the child advocacy centers that you've been at the front and center at, and we've been working with you on, but also a range of things we've done to create a stronger sex offender registry, deal with child predators, have strong penalties for those kinds of crimes. Make sure that we're increasing the age of protection for kids from 14 to 16, bringing in stronger rules against what we call barbaric cultural practices, some of the things that are done to young girls around the world, that we deal with those kinds of problems. So look, there's a whole range of things we've been doing. It's interesting you point out it's 60. I guess that doesn't surprise me. But it really tells you how much work we've had to do to peel back the layers and layers and try and reorient a system that was entirely wrongly reoriented, and making sure that in the future that the victims and that the children and that law-abiding citizens are really at the center of our criminal justice.
Thank you. There is strong empirical data showing that victims of crime can be forever affected by crimes against them. Victims tend to have higher rates of mental health difficulties, substance abuse challenges, and other issues as a result of their experiences. What can we do to help victims overcome these experiences and live full, meaningful lives?
Look, that's an excellent question. And as I said, that's from the beginning one of the things that has motivated us, understanding that while the criminal, in some cases, the offender, we may be able to provide treatment that will cause that person to have a life free of crime, that the real victim is the one who's experienced the most damage. And it's not only important that we show that the criminal is paying the price, but that we recognize the pain and the suffering of the victim. Look, I think maybe, Sheldon, but before I go any farther on this, I just want to say how important it has been for victims groups, those who have been family members of people who have suffered horrific crime, or people who have suffered it themselves, to come forward. And on this, look, I can't emphasize enough what an inspiration you are. It is... You and I have talked a lot about this. I mean, to people in this city, to people everywhere else, you could easily have just lived your life outwardly as a guy who, had a successful career at our great national sport, local hero, and a couple of the places you played. But instead, you decided to share your experiences, to tell people what it's really like, so that we obviously could deal with the offender in that particular case, but also to correct the system so we don't have that kind of thing in the future, and so that people can understand the real pain and suffering of victims. And I know how difficult that's been for you, but in every one thing I've learned about life, in every single field, whether it's stardom or whether it's being a victim of crime, there is nothing like a role model to show people how to move forward. And you've done that, and I think you deserve a tremendous amount of credit just for doing that kind of work. But look, you've done more than that. You've been very supportive. In fact, you've given tremendously valuable input in the criminal justice legislation we brought forward, things like the Victims' Bill of Rights and other pieces of legislation I've talked about. But you also have really spearheaded and brought together a whole range of experts around these child advocacy centers. Obviously, we were proud to name the one here in Calgary after you. Anybody who has an interest in this, I'd encourage people to go and see it. It's an amazing range of services and supports it provides to victims, particularly to very young children who, present very particular sensitive challenges when you're dealing with their kinds of trauma. It's a tremendous thing you started here. It's spread across the country. It's networked people. And I think it's making a tremendous difference in our society, not just in the knowledge and understanding that we increasingly have of victims of these kinds of offenses, but also real action in terms of dealing with it going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Your government has chosen to enact a number of mandatory minimum penalties as part of your agenda. The use of this type of sentencing has generated some controversy. Can you explain why you think they're necessary in certain cases?
Sure. Let me be clear, first of all, what we mean by the term, because I actually tend not to use the term mandatory minimum sentence because it implies to people that people will get a minimum sentence for doing something really horrific. The term I think that's actually correct is a mandatory prison sentence. A mandatory prison sentence for certain types of crime, for crimes against children, for crimes involving violence, for large-scale fraud that affect, literally hundreds of thousands of people. There have been, and I'm not suggesting it happens all the time, but there have been too many stories about people who have committed and been victims of terrible crime, and they literally do get a slap on the wrist. And look, we want to preserve, obviously, sufficient discretion for our judges in the judicial system in dealing with a range of circumstances around crimes. But, there is a common sense principle that certain types of crimes will deserve a minimum prison sentence. The idea that the kind of crimes I've mentioned would have no prison sentence whatsoever, I think is really just unthinkable. And the other part is the deterrence aspect of this. It's not just punishment as a matter of making sure the penalty fits the crime, but we know that in human behavior, one of the things that is effective in terms of deterring behavior is to make sure that there is some certainty about the kind of penalty you will actually pay if you embark on a certain action. And if there's a risk that no matter how serious your crime is, you will get little or no punishment, then any kind of deterrence, frankly, vanishes from the system. So we've operated on a very simple principle, which is that if you do serious crime, you will do some serious time. And if you commit crimes against defenseless children, you will go to prison. Those are the principles. Sheldon, let me tell the story because I know people will enjoy it. It's kind of when you and I first really got going. Example of this. Maybe it's not an example of a prison sentence, but the offender who committed crimes against you and many other boys. And we hadn't been in government very long, and the Minister of Justice always recalls phoning me to tell me that Graham James had been pardoned by the system. This was around Christmas time, I believe, and Thanksgiving. Easter, because I know I was at home in Calgary. And he still says he then held the phone this far away from his ear while I responded. And then after a few minutes of that, tried to assure me he had nothing to do with it. But this was an example where, and it's a concrete example of where the system has been at and the system we're trying to change. Where Graham James got a pardon, he did absolutely nothing whatsoever to earn that pardon. He didn't get the kind of sentence he should have got in the first place. He, did nothing to show remorse or to show improved behavior or anything, but gets the pardon automatically as a grant. And we took away that automatic pardon, and that should never have been there. And this is the kind of thing we're changing, and we're going to make sure it doesn't get changed back.
Yes. Well, I remember that day, and I got a call too. So Easter was quickly interrupted with media requests. I think everything that you're saying is bang on, and how do we tie it together? And I think that one of our biggest challenges has been in our communities is connecting the dots of trauma, of the impact on victims, and I think that is where we have really needed to strengthen, and where we have strengthened. And I think that we're leading all other countries in this area. With the $100 million announcement from Minister Ambrose out of your government around trauma-informed training for all frontline staff. That is absolutely huge. Nobody has child abuse and family violence. No other country in the world has child abuse and family violence under a health portfolio, and that's where it needs to be. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, look, let me... Look, just let me elaborate on this, Sheldon, because I think this moment tells you a lot about what motivates us. I mean, I can hear in your voice, I'm sure others can, how when that decision came down, you as a victim felt victimized again. And this is the kind of system we had developed, that frankly the kind of system the other parties want us to go back to, where an offender gets convicted, and all of the attention goes to the offender. What can we do to help the offender? Without any regard for how this impacts upon other people, upon society at large, and upon the victims themselves. And this was a perfect example of that. You know, I like to joke, it's not a joke, but I like to joke that we twisted the definition of the criminal justice system to somebody as you know, our basis of our justice system is someone is innocent until proven guilty. We'd gone to a place where someone was innocent after proven guilty. And, you know, when someone is an offender and they are convicted, yeah, sure, there needs to be some services for them, particularly if we think they're going to learn from it or move forward with their lives. But we don't put that ahead of the people they were convicted of hurting. And we will not do that, and that's the change we're making, the change we've got to carry forward.
Thank you. Is there more? Is there more that you want to accomplish? What will your justice priorities be going forward? How can we better support victims, especially given that victims of crime cost our economy $52 billion a year?
Yeah. The invisible cost, very high. Look, there's lots more. There's lots more we want to do. I keep telling, I know Ron, our other colleagues, I keep telling people that we just get amazed. The more we delve into this, the more that has to be done. How deeply reoriented the system, wrongly oriented the system had become. You know, for instance, we discovered, it was corrected in a private members bill by one of our members, that there was actually a special old age security benefit if you were a convict. You know, we repealed that against the special provisions for employment insurance for convicts. We repealed these things under private members legislation. Not all of our legislation has been government. A lot of our backbenchers have contributed. And these things were opposed by the other parties. So look, believe me, the more we look, the more problems we see. But there are some specific things I want to draw attention to, including an announcement today that I'll just make right now. Un gouvernement conservateur élu va faire deux choses que je suis certain auxquelles vous vous intéressez. Premièrement, nous allons doubler le financement des centres d'appui aux enfants que vous avez commencé, et aussi plus d'argent pour la recherche, sur la recherche pour des effets, des résultats, des effets subis par des victimes de crimes. Et ce sont deux annonces très importantes dans ce domaine. So just to repeat that, we're going to double the amount of financing that we're putting into the network of child advocacy centers that you have founded. Sheldon, that will, we now have some 20 of these centers across the country. That will in particular allow them to effectively branch into smaller communities where there may not be a physical center. So I think this is a great step forward. And we're also going to put greater money into research on the actual effects that victims of crime have suffered and how to deal with that. So I think these are two positive announcements and credit. credit to you for advancing these causes. Now, there also are other legislative priorities that we're moving forward with as top priorities when we get back. Some of them we've tabled in the House of Commons just before the end of the Parliament. I mentioned the Life Means Life legislation. There are certain types of horrific first-degree murder that when you get a life sentence, that should actually mean a life sentence. You don't get out early. No chance of parole. These are obviously, they're not. We're not talking about a huge number of crimes here, but we had Sharon Rosenfeld for that announcement, and the idea that someone like a Clifford Olson, that his victims would, be forced every year or every few years to come back and go through a hearing. It's absurd. Such an individual cannot and never was released and can never be released, and we need to make that clear in the law. We're going forward with tougher penalties for drunk driving. I think we've made some progress as a society, but as you know, there are still far too many people killed and injured in drunk driving accidents. We need to strengthen those laws. We've got legislation coming forward for faster removal of foreign criminals. It's unfortunate, as wildly successful as our immigration system is, there are always a few bad apples, and we need to be able to remove those people expeditiously from the country. That's something that all Canadians support. Mandatory prison sentences for the illegal use of firearms. We had some legislation we passed earlier in our government. The Supreme Court struck down some narrow elements of that legislation while leaving most of it intact. We want to fix those things to make sure that if you use guns to commit crime in this country, that you're appropriately punished for that. So these are among the top priorities. New resources for the RCMP to deal with the increasing phenomenon of the production of illegal narcotics. That's another priority. But as I say, one of the first things we'll be going forward with is doubling finance for child advocacy centers and child advocacy research. So congratulations to you.
Well, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you for that announcement, and thank you for the focus on victims. I think for a long time, people have never understood the impact of the invisible damage. So I know there's a lot of people here today that work in the field that have been, working and trying to deal with this important work where it's been a box check in the government priority. And I think that what you've done and what's been done over the years has taken it out of a box check and be put into a priority. And that's where we need to be. So thank you.